The Appalachian Booger, shape-shifting terror in the mountains for centuries, something has been changing its form in the isolated hollows of Appalachia, watching those who wander too far from home. Long before the Appalachian Mountains became synonymous with American folklore, they harbored secrets carried across an ocean and transformed by centuries of isolation. The settlers who pushed into these ancient ridges and hollows brought with them European traditions of witchcraft and transformation. The Cherokee and other indigenous peoples who already called these mountains home possessed their own understanding of beings that moved between forms. In the crucible of geographic isolation and cultural contact, something new emerged, a tradition that borrowed from both worlds and belonged entirely to neither. The mountain people who made their lives in these remote valleys developed a vocabulary for the supernatural threats they encountered. Among the most significant terms was Booger, a word that encompassed various frightening entities but held special meaning when applied to creatures that could change their shape. These were not the stuff of children's tales told for entertainment. Informants who shared accounts with folklorists in the 20th century spoke with the matter-of-fact confidence of those reporting genuine community history, their words carrying the weight of lived experience rather than the distancing markers of legend. James Mooney arrived in the southern Appalachians in the late 19th century, representing the Bureau of American Ethnology. His primary focus centered on Cherokee tradition, but his work positioned him precisely at the contact zone where indigenous and Anglo-American beliefs existed in the same geographic space. The transformation accounts he documented from Cherokee sources and the shape-shifting beliefs he encountered in Anglo-American mountain communities were not sealed off from each other. They shared the same ridges, the same isolated valleys, the same long winters when stories were told and traditions were preserved. The Appalachian Booger tradition that would be documented more extensively in later decades was already taking shape as a genuinely composite phenomenon, neither purely European nor purely indigenous, but something created through proximity and shared experience. The mountains themselves enforced the isolation that allowed this syncretic tradition to develop. Communities separated by a single ridge might go months without contact during harsh weather. Roads remained primitive well into the 20th century. The outside world with its standardizing influences, mass media, centralized religious authority, universal education, arrived late to these hollows. When folklorists began systematic documentation of Appalachian culture in the mid-20th century, they found traditions preserved with remarkable integrity, including accounts of shape-shifting encounters that informants treated as entirely real. Leonard Roberts conducted extensive fieldwork in Kentucky, approaching Appalachian folklore with scholarly rigor. His informants described individuals who possessed the ability to change form with the same casual certainty they might use when discussing a neighbor's farming practices or a relative's medical condition. These were not distant legends set in an undefined past. They were accounts embedded in community memory, often attached to specific locations and sometimes to individuals whose names were still remembered. The transformations described involved movement between human and animal forms, most commonly into predatory animals such as wolves, large cats, or aggressive dogs. The transformation was experienced by witnesses as fundamentally disorienting, a violation of natural order that carried immediate visceral threat. Richard Chase's documentation, while aimed at a general audience rather than academic specialists, preserved structural elements of transformation accounts that reflected genuine traditional belief. His work captured the narrative frameworks through which mountain communities understood and transmitted these experiences. The stories he recorded consistently featured certain elements. The transformation occurred with purpose rather than accident, the transformed being demonstrated intelligence and awareness, and encounters typically happened at liminal times and places: dusk, isolated trails, the edges of settlements where human habitation gave way to wilderness. Patrick Gaynor's work in West Virginia documented shape-shifting accounts from communities that had remained geographically isolated enough to preserve older traditions being erased elsewhere by mid-century modernization. His informants described encounters with entities that moved between forms in ways that defied natural explanation. The accounts shared remarkable consistency despite coming from communities with limited contact with each other. Witnesses reported seeing animals that behaved with unsettling intelligence, that watched them with evident awareness, that seemed to understand human speech or anticipate human action. Some accounts described seeing the transformation itself, a human figure becoming animal or an animal form, revealing impossibly human characteristics. The nature of threat in these accounts deserves particular attention. Informants did not describe random wildlife encounters or cases of mistaken identity. The Booger, whether understood as a transformed human practitioner or an independent supernatural entity, was experienced as purposefully threatening. It demonstrated awareness of its observer. Its behavior suggested intention rather than instinct. Witnesses consistently reported feeling specifically targeted, as though the entity had sought them out rather than simply crossing their path by chance. The departure of the creature was typically as sudden and inexplicable as its appearance. It would vanish into darkness or around terrain features in ways that seemed to violate normal animal movement. The physical descriptions varied, but certain patterns emerged across the documentation. The creatures were often described as larger than normal for their apparent species. Their movements combined animal physicality with something fundamentally wrong, gaits that seemed slightly off, postures that suggested awareness beyond what an animal should possess, eyes that reflected light in unusual ways or that seemed to hold human intelligence. Some witnesses reported that the creatures smelled wrong, carrying odors that mixed animal musk with something else, something that registered at a primal level as dangerous. The cultural response to these threats drew on multiple traditions. Mountain communities developed and maintained protective practices that combined European and indigenous elements into a syncretic whole. Silver, inherited from European werewolf tradition, was considered effective against shape-shifting threats. Salt, with its ancient associations with purity and preservation, was used in protective rituals. Running water, iron, and Christian prayer represented the European contribution to mountain protective practice. Specific plants, some native to Appalachia, others transplanted from Europe and maintained in mountain gardens, were recognized as having power against supernatural threats. Directional rituals and the services of recognized mountain healers represented practices that likely derived from or were influenced by indigenous tradition. What makes these protective measures particularly significant is their consistency across a culture that lacked centralized religious or medical institutions to standardize practice. Mountain communities were predominantly Protestant, but represented numerous denominations with varying theological positions. They had no single authority figure who could have imposed uniform supernatural beliefs or protective practices. The fact that similar protective measures appear repeatedly across the documentation suggests they were developed and preserved in response to a genuinely perceived threat rather than transmitted through institutional authority. The Appalachian Booger tradition represents a case study in cultural synthesis. European settlers arrived with established traditions of human transformation, werewolf beliefs, witch lore, stories of cunning folk who could take animal form. These traditions had deep roots in European folklore and had survived the Atlantic crossing despite the disruption of immigration. The Cherokee and other indigenous peoples of the southern Appalachians possessed their own sophisticated understanding of transformation, of individuals who could move between human and animal states, of the complex relationships between human and animal consciousness. When these traditions came into contact in the isolated valleys and ridges of the mountains, they did not simply exist side by side. They influenced each other, borrowed from each other, eventually creating something that belonged fully to neither parent tradition, but carried elements of both. The folklorists who documented these accounts were primarily interested in cultural and literary preservation rather than paranormal investigation. They approached informants as sources of traditional narrative and cultural practice rather than as witnesses to supernatural phenomena. This methodological stance provides useful perspective. The accounts they collected were not shaped by leading questions about paranormal activity or by investigative frameworks that might influence how informants described their experiences. The folklorists were recording what mountain people said about shape-shifting encounters because those accounts were part of mountain culture, not because the folklorists were attempting to prove or disprove the reality of transformation. This documentation provides an important counterpart to the more investigation-focused records of similar phenomena in other cultural contexts. The skinwalker tradition of the Navajo and other indigenous peoples of the Southwest, for example, has been documented through frameworks that often emphasize investigation and evidence collection. The Appalachian material, collected primarily through folklore methodology, describes structurally similar phenomena: human practitioners who transform, entities that move between forms, encounters that are experienced as genuinely threatening, but through an entirely different methodological lens. That both sets of records, produced by researchers with different goals and different methodological frameworks, document the same core phenomenon suggests that phenomenon exists independently of the frameworks used to document it. The Appalachian Booger tradition persists into the present, though modernization has inevitably changed how these accounts are transmitted and understood. The geographic isolation that preserved older traditions has been reduced by improved roads, telecommunications, and economic integration with the broader United States. Mountain communities that once existed in profound isolation now participate in mass culture. Yet accounts of shape-shifting encounters continue to emerge from these regions, now often shared through internet forums and social media rather than through face-to-face community transmission. The core elements remain consistent: entities that move between forms, encounters that feel purposeful and threatening, experiences that resist easy explanation. The preservation of this tradition by folklorists who were working before the modern paranormal investigation movement provides documentation untainted by contemporary assumptions about supernatural phenomena. These accounts were collected when informants had no reason to shape their experiences to fit popular media representations of shapeshifters or transformation. They represent a relatively pure transmission of traditional belief and reported experience, valuable precisely because they were documented by researchers who had no investment in proving or disproving the reality of what their informants described. The Appalachian Mountains remain among the oldest on Earth, their ridges worn smooth by hundreds of millions of years of weathering. The hollows and valleys between those ridges harbored traditions that arrived from multiple continents and merged into something uniquely American. The Booger, the shape-shifting threat that moves between forms, represents one thread in that complex cultural tapestry. Whether understood as transformed human, independent entity, or something that resists easy categorization, it remains part of mountain tradition, its accounts preserved by folklorists who recognized that what mountain people believed about the supernatural was itself a fact worth documenting. If you found this case compelling, subscribe to Vanishing Roads for more documented paranormal investigations from around the world. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented case files. All events reference real investigations and reported incidents.